Good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to you all to another edition of MEDtalkx on Pendle Radio 103.1 FM. I'm going to be introducing our guests very shortly. My thanks to my co-host Mehran Javid, who is here along with myself, Fahim Shakur. Before we start, the phone numbers, in case anyone has any questions about any of the topics or wish to talk about anything, the numbers are 01282 723 455. I repeat, the studio number 01282 723 455, and the WhatsApp number is 075 22 723 455. Sorry, I repeat again, 075 22 723 455. Over to you, Mehran.
Thank you, Fahim, and hello, everybody. So I've got two guests today. So I'm going to start with Pete. So Pete Reece is the owner of Remarkable Resilience and is a resilience coach and trainer. So as a response to a debilitating long-term illness, he spent 15 years researching and experimenting on how to become a more resilient. And this lived experience combined with his coaching and training skills has led him to create the Wacky Dai Mindset. Hello, Pete.
Hello, Mehran. Hello, Fahim. Hi, and thank you very much for having me. Hello to all the listeners.
And our next guest is Keith Martin, who works for Lancashire County Council on street lighting and is the union convener as well. His bio is actually pretty long, so I'm going to try and get the salient points, but he also volunteers at the Employee Welfare Contact and is chair of the Highways Health, Safety and Welfare Committee. He's also the chair of the Neighbourhood Forum and the Climate Emergency Committee. Within these appointments, he also represents the council at the Lancashire Association of Local Councils and is on the Finance and Management Committee for the Executive. Hello.
Good afternoon.
Great. Excellent. Thank you for the introductions, Mehran. So we're going to go straight into it and really start with you, Pete, really. Let's talk about coronavirus and the lockdown. Can you tell us a little bit about how it's been affecting you and some thoughts and reflections on it?
Yeah, I think the biggest point of interest for me at the moment, I think, is particularly to do with social distancing. And I think there's so much about how we as human beings need each other at the moment and how much we're probably missing physical contact. I mean, we're social animals, aren't we? And we know from children, for example, who are denied physical love, the harm that does. And an example is yesterday in the road where I live, there was a socially distanced street party. And there was a singer arrived out of the blue, which very few people knew about, and he performed in the street for everybody. And we had passers-by stopping, people coming out of their houses, and it was a really, music is emotional anyway, and we had that. It felt like a really emotional moment, that everybody coming together, and we could hear voices in the road for the first time in ages. And I think people are really, really missing each other, and I really hope that at the end of all this, it somehow brings us closer together in our local communities and perhaps even as a human race.
So really good insights. Then Keith, what has been your insight so far for the many weeks? It's been over 40 days now in lockdown for us.
Yeah, I'm just looking at my calendar and I'm on day 47 of being away from work. We were sent home in the afternoon or mid-morning afternoon. It was a strange sort of, yes, it's a long weekend, and then all of a sudden the reality sort of kicks in when you start hearing of your friends and relatives who are not very well. It took a while, I think, for people to grasp the reality of it or the enormity of it. But I think it's sort of working now. For me, I've been lucky. I've been trying to keep myself busy. In the morning, I volunteered to call care homes, and we collect data for those for work. And that's an interesting topic. And I get to speak to 10 to 15 different people every morning, so it's not such a bad thing. The afternoons can drag on, so I've tried to keep topics per day. So I said, right, tomorrow I'm doing this, tomorrow and the next day I'm doing that, and try to stick to that. So there's a bit of a routine. I've converted my van into a sleeper van now, so that's a good thing. But I'm going back to work on the 11th for 5 days on a call-out basis. So it's a bit nerve-wracking because you don't know what's going to happen. I haven't been out really for so many weeks. Since the 6th of April was the last time I was out. So it's a bit of interpretation, and there's a fear factor and a bit of paranoia perhaps, because I don't want to get ill and I don't want anyone else to get ill. So you've got that on your head. I live opposite a residential home, so there's a lot of vulnerable people in the immediate area. So I'll put signs up in the bus stop there and things like that, just to get people to try and sort of respect other people, really.
Yeah, it's you're right, but both of you, because it really has affected us in quite different ways, hasn't it? And I know, knowing Fahim and obviously our own kind of personal circumstances, we've had to or continue to deal with some of the issues regarding coronavirus on a personal level. But clearly, on reflection, I think I take your point, Pete, about valuing of relationships. There's clearly a sense of gratification, a sense of appreciation that was present. But I do feel that coming out of this, whenever that might be, we'll be in a much better place because of those bonds to be rekindled and reconnected.
Hope so. Yeah.
Yeah, and Pete, if we continue in terms of the actual insights and reflections you've made, a lot of people are keeping journals and other things. I know we've discussed off air regarding reflective journals and so on. What are your thoughts on how people should keep this as a memory or log all of this down?
I'm a big fan of what's called expressive writing. I think it's an excellent well-being tool to get down on paper, to express our emotions on paper. Very often we feel as though we can't express our emotions verbally for whatever reason, and at the moment that might have a lot to do with lacking that physical contact. But there's an enormous amount of research around expressive writing that it's something that can really help people to identify, first of all, what it is that they may be worried about, and to putting down in a way that we can actually see what the problem is and how that is affecting me, how I feel about that. There's something actually very, very powerful about it. And I think combined with some reflection about perhaps what we can learn from our current situation, I think those two things together are quite a powerful tool. And I would encourage everybody to pick up a pen and start writing about their experiences. I really would.
And Keith, yourself, have you come across any ways to get people to express things, or any networks you're doing as part of your work or personally to try and get people through this whole lockdown?
I'm an elected member or councillor for where I am, which is Middlefirth in South Ribble. I'm also on the town council as well. So we have a community hub at the borough council. Most borough councils have a similar sort of setup where we've tried to organise food deliveries, medicine deliveries, buddy phone calls, and the occasional visit if it's needed. And we can signpost to people and help them with their benefits and things like that. So that's working really well. And we were lucky as a council because we started doing the food hunger program, the holiday hunger program, where children who get free school meals were continuing to get something during the holidays. And because we had that all set up, it whizzed through and we sort of hit the ground running. The dedication and the work of the council officers, I know a lot of people will often moan about them, but they pulled everything out of the bag this time, and they're working day and night, 24/7 shifts. And a lot of them are at home. There's issues. I have issues with working at home because it can have a detrimental effect to your mental health, and it can alienate a part of your house. But if you deal with that and work with that, I mean, mine again is music, as Pete says. I listen to the Jive streams at 8:30 on Facebook, not a plug. And it's just that hours interaction where you can type in, they'll comment on what you type. And I think that keeps your brain moving, because I think once your brain stops moving, you start disappearing off into the ether somewhere, and that's where you start getting lost.
So about coping, Keith, because you touched on care homes, which is a very important segment in the community. What have you seen, and what are your kind of reflections from what's happening in care homes? Because we know it's a very vulnerable area to work in, and it's very personal to me, because that is one of the areas that I do support, given my background as a psychiatrist.
They're working very hard. They've isolated themselves probably earlier because of the nature of the bill, because I think you only need one person with any illness in a care home, and it whizzes around, especially when you start looking at special needs and things like that, people who are unable to control themselves in some fashion. Personally, I can't give too much detail away, but the care homes are resilient. They're working very hard to try and keep stuff in. It's the external stuff that seems to be letting them down a little bit. And I think we've had experience of that within this group as well. And it can be a nervous time for them, because if they don't have the right equipment, sometimes that causes anxiety, stress, and people sort of don't want to go to work. So that they're doing very well, and I think me ringing them up and being cheeky and stuff like that seems to break their day up, or their morning, so to speak. So I mean, I finish at 12 and then that's me done, but you still have to organize if they want PPE. You can expedite that as well, which fills them with a bit more confidence that they can carry on doing what they're doing without having to worry about reusing anything. So.
I think it kind of goes on quite nicely to the next segment, really, with you, Pete, because care homes, and we move on to illness, really. Obviously, with your background, having fought off chronic illness, Pete, what kind of tips would you give to people who are living with chronic illness at the moment under lockdown?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because we've not just got the people who are currently living with chronic illness, but I think we're finding out more and more that there may be some long-term effects from having had COVID-19. I was reading this morning about that some people are showing signs of scarring of the lungs and breathing difficulties. And in terms of my experiences with a long-term illness, I think the biggest thing that helped me was going back to really right at the start of my illness. That's going back 16 years ago. I woke up one morning, and the only way I could get to the bathroom and back was crawling along on the floor. And I didn't know it at the time. I suspected what it was, but I was eventually diagnosed with an illness called chronic fatigue, or ME. And it meant that for a time I was bedbound, for an even longer time than that. I was wheelchair bound. And of course that takes its toll on you. And I felt, particularly when I was bedbound, I felt depressed. And there was one particular morning where everybody else had gone out of the house. My wife had gone to work, the children were at school, and I was lying in bed feeling very lonely, feeling very sorry for myself. I felt even more depressed, started crying, and I realized that I had to do something to snap out of it. And I reached for a pen and paper at the side of the bed, and I wrote down at the top of the paper, what can I do about it? And I wrote down perhaps half a dozen things that could help me move forward a little bit, if you like. And it wasn't so much what I wrote down that was of interest. It was how I felt through having done that. My mood lifted significantly. And what I know now is that in psychological terms, it's called acting in your internal locus of control. And there are an enormous number of studies, a lot of research shows that acting within this internal locus of control enhances your well-being, and it has many other benefits as well. And that's certainly what I felt. I've really felt as though that mood had lifted just by asking that question, what can I do about this?
And that's very powerful, isn't it? It's because I guess taking leadership of your own course, of your own destiny. Because when we talk about resilience, we talk about the ability to bounce back, or bounce back ability, however you want to phrase it. And I guess it's also an explanation of a state where you want to try and maintain or supersede in terms of positive outcomes, and everyone's kind of got their own definition of what a positive outcome is. But as you've alluded to, whether it's about optimism, whether it's about self-worth, whether it's about the ability to face fear, these can all be kind of better understood in terms of where you are today because of what happened before.
I found as well that a big thing for me as time went on that really kept me going as well was having hope. And again, I know from the reading I've done since, how much in terms of positive psychology that the effect that increased hope has on people's well-being as well. And where that hope is directed and focused, for example, it's connected to a goal. Again, I found that of huge help to me. There was a journalist many years ago called Alan Johnston, a BBC journalist, who was kidnapped in Gaza, and he talked about having a mental lifeboat, something to keep hold of. And something I would encourage everybody to think about what their mental lifeboat is at the moment, something that they can hang on to and look towards the horizon. I mean, in my case, I didn't know that I was going to get better, but my hope was that one day I would be helping other people develop their well-being and resilience, and perhaps even speaking about it on the radio. So, here we are, so many years later. But yeah, building hope, finding that mental lifeboat to cling on to, I think is a very, very powerful thing, especially in a time like this.
Some really good points there, Keith. I know you may not have had a chronic illness, perhaps like Pete, but coming at it from either the point of the council and helping as employers to people who may be struggling, what are your thoughts on how we can cope with illness and actually get through that in some way?
I think it's some of it's going back on your own experience. I mean, in 2001, I was diagnosed with chronic depression. Came home rattling with a big tub of Prozac, thinking everything was going to be all right, and that was the start of the downfall, or the further downfall. It wasn't as well understood then as it was now, and once I got through the lull bit and met a friend who supported me, I moved up here. I was homeless, and I became the mayor, so like a reverse Dick Whittington, you could say. But the whole process of that was my, I suppose, my lifeboat, as you could see. But the mayor bit wasn't the lighthouse in the distance that was either warning me of the rocks or making me feel safe that the shore was close by. But I mean, I think as a union side, we have great concerns about mental health. We're starting to do a lot of training with mental health buddies, mental health first aiders, and things like that. And the workplace now, where I work, they've started to do welfare, mental health welfare. We've got a contract with Remploy and people like that to try and help the workforce. Unfortunately, this working from home, which quite a lot of people are doing, as far I think South Ribble Borough Council, half of their employees are working from home. And sort of from the fact that if your house is your workplace, you tend to you get people, they do more. People do more when they're at home. I think, yeah, because it's there all the time. It's in their face. And what tends to happen is you don't sit properly. You're using inappropriate equipment because you're using your own personal equipment. Your bills are going up and things like that. So all that adds onto it. So we need to try and support people for when I mean, it's 7 weeks. There's the two sides of it, those who have to stay at home and those who will be coming to work. There's two factions there, and the workplace has to be prepared, very well prepared, and we need all the support there as well. For instance, you've got Chorley Interchange will have to open. It's been shut for 5 weeks. All the water will have to be purged from the water systems, all that sort of thing for Legionella and stuff like that. So there's all those things that we need to make sure is done for people so they know that they're going back to a safe place, and support those who are unable to go back because they're still either they're looking after themselves in a 12-week period, or they continue to work at home to maintain safe distance in the workplace.
I've had a question come in. So I do want to always get through questions. If I can go to you, Pete, for this one. It's about actually talking about chronic fatigue. There's a question from a listener in Nelson. Does the panel have solutions to chronic fatigue? Is NLP a good treatment? And for those who don't know what NLP abbreviation stands for, that's neuro-linguistic programming. Any ideas you want to speak about, Pete, on what's worked for you?
Yeah, I think the thing about chronic fatigue is that it seems to be a very individual disease. That it's not necessarily the case that one's personal experience is like another's. I've certainly used elements of NLP to kind of manage my own illness, but I would hesitate to say that anything is a particular cure or not. What I would encourage people to do, however, is if there is no cure, is to take as much responsibility for their own illness as possible. And I mean, I spent 15 years researching and experimenting on myself, really, about things that may or may not work. And if the listener feels as though there are elements of NLP that help them, that's fantastic. If there's some things that aren't, then move on to something else. I found using CBT on myself a great help, for example. But I think the biggest help to me, I think, in terms of a practice, has been meditation. But I think that is perhaps individual to me.
Okay. Just for the listeners out there who may not have heard of chronic fatigue, obviously it's a recognized condition which has tiredness and many other symptoms. And normally, as we always try and say, it's always best to see your GP if you're haven't, because they often take an actual history and ask you about your symptoms and then organize appropriate blood tests and urine tests and so on. Mehran, any tips from the psychiatry world on chronic fatigue?
No, it's becoming increasingly recognized. Unfortunately, there's lots of mental health illnesses related to it, especially whether it's around depression or anxiety, or if you are burdened by medications that emerge because of your symptoms emerge later on in life, then you can have cognitive problems, so brain fog. So there's lots of little intricacies, and that's where, as Pete said, every individual is quite different. So you've got to try to approach it as such. But as you said, if you have concerns, if you've been investigated for something but that doesn't appear to have fixed that issue, always revisit the issue with your GP and see what you can do next.
Yeah, I think that's important, because obviously there's different treatments like CBT, as you mentioned before. So we know about that already. And obviously there is graded exercise therapy. There's different things and nice guidelines that can help with it. So I think that's important. Is there anything that you can add to that, Keith, on that discussion? Or back to Pete, if not.
Well, just picking up on something that Keith said before about depression and mental health, I think it's something that, talking to members of the public and doctors recently, I think there's an increasing recognition about the impact of mental health, the impact on mental health rather from the COVID-19 pandemic, and it could be one of the hidden costs that's building up in society and in the system that we're only really going to know about much later. And I really hope we're going to have the resources to be able to deal with it. In some ways, it could end up being almost like a second pandemic. I think there's an awful lot of people suffering. I really, really do.
No, I agree with that, Pete. And it's just difficult to put on a timeline as to when do you actually get a clear understanding of what's happening in terms of ripple effects with the coronavirus. We're already seeing that, presentations to A&E are in periods of crisis. There's lots of emotional dysregulation that we should try to manage, especially in primary care and secondary care. And that's just from a general population perspective. But if you've got mental health problems yourself, and let's say you've got dementia, for example, you're in a care home and suddenly the whole place becomes very different. You're not able to reorientate yourself. You're not able to see familiar faces. And, I don't think the technology was probably there before the lockdown went in. To ensure that those connections were maintained. So there's lots of issues, and I hope it's not a long-lasting effect.
Yeah, I agree.
Have we got Keith back?
He's there, but I think this may be the right time to take a break. But stay with us. We will come back in around 3 to 4 minutes time.
Thank you so much. Great. Welcome back, everyone. We're back on MEDtalkx on 103.1 FM, Pendle. We've got Keith and Pete, for those of you who have been late to the show. Keith, I want to come straight on to you now. Hopefully your microphone's working again. And we're talking again about environmental health for this episode and this segment of the program. Obviously, you're involved with the council, and environmental health is part of that, including repairs and so on that landlords need to do and so on. Can you tell the audience a little bit about what that involves and the sort of things you might have come across?
My role with environmental health is that I chair the Climate Emergency Committee, and we sort of look at air pollution and other pollutions and from where they come from. It's difficult to try and control some of them because the pollution doesn't know a boundary, or it only knows a physical boundary. So as far as sort of across Europe, we're getting pollution from all over the world in some degree, and we're affected by pollution with our sunlight. As far as what we've noticed is that, and everyone would have noticed, that you don't taste the air anymore. It doesn't have that taste to it. There's no litter. I've seen 1 or 2 items of litter, and that's near the recently opened fried chicken company. I won't go into detail. So
we all know which one you mean.
I'm trying to be diplomatic. I don't want to get into trouble. Well, you into trouble because you're in charge, because you look the oldest. So yeah, I mean, you're getting. I have friends who live in Blackpool who say the water, you can see the bottom of the beach now and things like that. So it's had a good effect, and the sun's shining. There's nothing to stop the sun now. There's no airplane. The condensation that comes out the airplane isn't blocking or making artificial clouds and things like that. So we're seeing the environment in its natural state. That can have an effect on sunsets and sunrise because it won't be as spectacular because of the lack of air pollution. But you should feel better. You should be able to breathe better. People are using their cars less and things like that, using their cycles more. I'm part of the cycle to work scheme, so I try and cycle half the time to work. When I get a chance, if I'm not carrying huge bags of other people's problems, it seems. But as the environmental side of it with housing is a big issue as well, because I mean, everything is the environment, and we have to sort of realize that we're part of it. We don't control it. We're just part of it. We are of this planet, and the whole planet has an issue, which includes us. So we just need to make sure that what we always think about how we do things, what we do when we buy it, things like that. But yeah, I think, and also people realize that it's a bit healthier. They feel better. They're not having to wash their windows so much. And if you're washing your windows a lot, then you need, your lungs are getting clogged up, and it goes through your pores depending on the ppms and things like that. So it's been a big deal, and this has been a big realization. And what people will notice is, as soon as if we go back to what was the normal, all that will come back. And we need to try, and we've got an advantage here. We had a plan to reduce emissions. We've drastically removed them, reduced them to a safer level, and we just need to try and maintain them at that, and try and think about how we commute, how we go to work. Do we drive the car to the corner shop, or do we walk? So there's all those sort of things, and that all affects your health. The longer we live, and the longer we live healthier, the less electricity we need to keep hospitals. Everything has a link. It's all linked to what we do. So everything that we do, we're responsible for the atmosphere and for the environment. I can go on for a long time.
What about yourself, Pete? Anything on that issue?
Yeah, I think the issue of air pollution is interesting, particularly because just like we're finding with COVID-19 that people in the lower socioeconomic groups are disproportionately affected by air pollution and by COVID-19, and it just brings it home to you, or to me particularly. I live in a very nice part of the world, and how lucky we've been here during this lockdown to have access to clean air, etc., etc. But that's not the reality for the majority of people. And the question is, for us as a society, is what are we going to go back to after all this? Are we going to go back to just a ramping up of air pollution again? And are we going to accept that means that people who live in urban areas are going to have that disproportionate effect on them? So I find that very unpalatable, and I really hope that it's part of the great awakening with this illness, that maybe we'll start doing some things differently.
We received a question, and I guess to some extent we've answered it. Has the lockdown helped reduce the pollution? And we can clearly see that having numerous amounts of cars will certainly help reduce the degree of burden. If we look at China, for example, between January and February, the degree of nitrogen dioxide was less than at least 40% compared to the previous year. And if we think about nitrogen dioxide, that's a natural gas that's related with smog, acid rain, as well as lots of respiratory conditions. So things like that can obviously lead to millions of deaths, according to the WHO. So clearly, I think that there's lots of benefits. I guess from a personal reflection, it's just I'm just more concerned about the recycling and what's happening, because it's there's only non-recyclable items, so it's and a lot of the tips have been closed down. They're slowly starting to reopen, but clearly my green bin, and I guess it's different colors in different places, but that's the compost and the the food stuff. This is my son here, who's about to join us live.
This is a BBC presenter moment, isn't
it? Yeah. Are you going to join us? Okay.
So I think, Keith, you wanted to speak a little bit about air pollution yourself, didn't you?
Yeah. Where we are, we have about 3 or 4 areas of 3 or 4 areas of concern with air pollution, and of course, overnight, it's gone. We know that 4% of deaths in the community are attributed are early because of air pollution, and it causes a lot of misery for people. You won't realize it until you got COPD or something like that, where you actually feel every molecule of air as it goes down, and what's in that air, whether it hurts you or whether it keeps you alive. And that, again, that helps with the welfare side of it, because if you're in a healthy environment, you're going to feel healthy and you're going to feel better. You're going to feel more positive. If the social inequalities, the demographics of certain areas, where in South Ribble, within 2 miles, you can have a difference of early premature death of 8 years. That's quite substantial. And unfortunately, while we're polluting the air, that is starting to go down again. It's reached a peak. And we've seen it start to reduce, mainly in males, because males are the ones who tend to work outside most. I work on highways, so I have cars going past me all the time until I go up to my lamppost, and then it's all different. But yeah, air pollution is the biggest killer that we see at the moment, and I think the sooner we reduce that, the sooner that more people can live a bit longer and with a bit more dignity in their life.
I mean, you can talk about many things in terms of air pollution. Having traveled the world before the lockdown earlier in the year, people were wearing masks because of pollution, I saw in different parts of the world. And it's now the sort of like an irony that people are now wearing it for the virus now. Pete, you wanted to come in there?
Yeah, it's just led me to think that I think I've read, Keith might be able to confirm this, but I seem to remember reading some time ago that we actually, in our urban areas, we actually have the worst air pollution in Europe. And I'm just wondering if that is the case, and we know that air pollution leads on to chronic lung diseases, for example, and we know that if you've got a lung malfunction, that you might be more likely to suffer from COVID-19. And I'm just wondering if air quality is a contributory factor to the higher death rate we're experiencing in this country at the moment. I've not read that anyway. It's just something I'm wondering about at the moment.
It's an interesting thought. I've not read anything to do with that as of yet. I guess there's so many pressing research inquiries at the moment on COVID-19 to do with obviously ethnicity, socioeconomic class, obviously, and obviously gender even. There's so many different research opportunities at the moment that haven't focused on the air pollution, but it's an interesting thought. Has anyone else on the panel heard anything about air pollution linked with this?
The only Keith, it's the only thing I can equate it to. I mean, you have to. I think while we haven't got the research, we have to use a bit of logic. I was going to say common sense, but that can come in various forms. But logic would dictate that if you're having issues with breathing, or you're breathing in stuff that's not good for you, same as smoking and things like that, that any illness you get that's related to your lungs is going to exacerbate the original issue you have already. And I think I've mentioned this to Fahim before, but I feel that this moment, while we're in this lockdown, there will be positive effects. I know we're talking negatives, but the positive effects will be like the children. When you take the children away from Chernobyl for a month every year, you increase their life by 5 or 6 years. And I think this period of time, people, when they get to the end of it, they'll realize that they feel better. And like the children of Chernobyl, they'll get to live a little bit longer, and perhaps it might not be a lesson learned straight away, but in the years to come, we can reflect back, and no doubt in hundreds of years' times, people will dig us up and analyze our bones and realize sort of what we did and what we went through. And this period of time will always be logged within our ancestry. So I think, yeah, it's a big issue still. We need to sort air pollution out, and that's my key word, I think, for today, or comment on today, really.
I think it would be a shame if we just went back to usual business, isn't it, at the end of all this. I think how people do things efficiently has been brought into question. I think a lot of day-to-day work, especially occupational work, could be done differently, especially with use of video conferencing. That would directly reduce the amount of cars on the road, and it'd just be a real shame if we just went back to how things were. And I do agree. I think this is an opportunity. And if we weren't in lockdowns, whether that would have meant that there would be more problems from a respiratory side of things, that's certainly an interesting question to try and answer.
Yeah, I know that time's pressing on. We're always against time on this show. We've got a lot more to cover. So I want to go on to the next segment of the program, which was to do with the third sector and its economic impact. Pete, I gather you wear another hat and you're involved in the third sector as well. Can you tell the audience a bit about that?
Yeah, I'm a trustee for a domestic violence charity in Wigan, yeah, it's a strange one because we know that it's been very well publicised in the national news that the rate of domestic violence incidents has increased massively. It seems to vary from week to week what's reported, but I've read figures like 45% increase, 70% increase. and it's really distressing to hear about. And at the same time, trying to manage that problem, because we've got a responsibility to our staff as well, to keep them safe, to keep them healthy. So they're working from home and trying to support people over the phone, and that's not ideal. But this, as trustees, we're concerned about the impact on them as employees. They're doing an absolutely fabulous job, putting in their own time, over and above what they're paid for. Wonderful, wonderful people. But at the same time, we're dealing with the impact of austerity, which has been going on for so long, and the cutback on funding that's been going on for years and years. It's a smaller service than it was, but faced with a much higher demand. We have been lucky. Dias, the name of the charity, has got one or two small grants to cope with that increased workload, but it's not enough. It's not enough. It's as simple as that. And at the end of the day, it's not about the charity struggling. It's the people that we help who are going to struggle as a result.
While you're there, Pete, do you want to give a shout out to anyone at Dias today? Yeah,
if Gemma, who's the manager, and I'm not sure who's working today. I know we've got volunteers working at the weekend on taking messages on Facebook, but I'm not sure who's working. But Mandy and Jane are the other two members of staff, and with Gemma, they're doing absolutely wonderful job. So I hope they're listening to receive that little bit of acknowledgement.
And yourself, Keith, or in terms of voluntary work, obviously you're quite involved in the third sector yourself, aren't you?
More trying to facilitate the third sector in giving them the ability to do what they want to do. Things like community support grants, maintaining people's houses, so when they come out of hospital, they can move straight into their house rather than have to go into a care home or be stuck in the hospital. So there's that side of it. One of the charities I regularly contribute to is a Leyland charity called Sleep, which is spelled SLEAP, and they have host homes, and generally people will give up a room and look after a young person who is in imminent danger of becoming homeless, and will support them for a day, a couple of days, a week, sometimes months. That's always busy. There's a lot of fractured families where circumstances that we're dealing with as a community are invoking certain stresses which we find difficult to deal with. So it's bouncing along, but as people are losing money from their pay, they're not contributing to these charities, and we're finding that the borough councils and more increasingly town councils and parish councils have to chip in. It's easier for town councils and parish councils because they don't have a cap on their budget, so they can raise their precepts according to the need. But when you get to a borough level, we're all trying to do something. We're trying to squeeze so much down an ever increasingly reducing sort of like hole, and it's hard work. So far, I've not had to say no to anyone, but I'm dreading that day. Where if I say I can't do it, I can find someone who can, and that's becoming harder and harder and harder. So I think we again, it's when we come out of this, we've stretched our society to a almost breaking point, and we probably need to really need to reevaluate that and try and reproportion what we have available to us.
I think there's various figures being touted out, but some estimates are saying that around £4 billion of economic value is potentially lost during the 12-week lockdown period. So it just creates that kind of flavor of how much funding potential is lost, as well as the reliance by other means, as you said, about funds or through other networks where you can get, emergency aid. There's obviously lots of financial means of support that are provided by the government, but you want to get on with what your charity and what your organization's trying to do. And a lot of charities have also invested, on the stock markets, and especially with some of the stocks being devalued, that obviously adds another layer of burden to that. I guess it's interesting, Pete, you just talked about domestic abuse. I just want to touch on on that, just for our viewers and listeners to just be aware that domestic abuse is not always a physical type of violence. It could be coercive control, it could be economic, it could be emotional. And if you are concerned, or if you are aware of someone who needs that help, then please do encourage them to seek it. In emergency situations, contact the police, but there are lots of charities around as well. So please do refer to the government website. So there is a domestic abuse helpline. There's also BME support services as well, such as MCAN. So do look on the government website for further details.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of specifics, I know for the 40,000 or so runners who missed out on the 2020 London Marathon that's been put back now to October, it would have raised maybe over £66 million as it did last year. So although there's hidden sort of things, but there's actually a lot of charities who've missed out on that money as well now, so that we might not have recognized. And it's worth bearing all of these charities in mind just during this lockdown. Do you have any thoughts, Pete, yourself, in terms of how other charities are coping?
My heart goes out to them. It really does. It's been a struggle for so long. Diocese was in the position a few years ago that it was used to get some statutory funding, and that has been whittled away as the effects of austerity were felt within local government and other services, but raising money for domestic abuse and domestic violence is very often not seen as a flavour of the month in terms of fundraising, which is an unfortunate thing. So it makes it doubly hard for an organisation working in that field. So we're having to work very, very hard to access additional funding. And as I say, we've been lucky recently to get one or two small amounts, which might help carry us through this current situation. But when you think about those figures connected to the London Marathon and so on, you just wonder what the effects are going to be further down the line. Really, really concerning.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we've just got another segment before we come to the end of our show. We've just got another 5-10 minutes or so, and it's going to be your favorite topic coming up, Pete: wellbeing and resilience. So let's start with you, Pete. Give us some tips and tell us all about wellbeing and resilience to get near the end of the show.
Well, so people sometimes ask me what my top 3 wellbeing tips are, and I think it's a podcast I listen to sometimes, where there's a guest every week who tends to be an expert in some element of psychology or other, and they always ask them at the end of the show, what's your one big tip for well-being? What should the listeners be doing? And when I've listened to these shows, there's 3 things keep coming up time and time again. So they're like my 3 big well-being tips. The first is exercise. I know it's a bit of a cliche now, but if all the benefits of exercise were available in a pill, we'd be popping them like crazy. So encouraging people to get consistent exercise, especially in the current climate, I think is really, really important. The second thing is meditation. Meditation is something that helped me massively. In fact, it turned my life around completely. And the research into meditation is now beginning to catch up with what people in the Far East and the Indian subcontinent have known for centuries, is that it is something that can really help with our well-being, with calmness and so on. So that's number 2, well-being. And the third one is has been studied an awful lot as well, and that's gratitude. Getting a gratitude attitude, making it a practice. It's hard to say whether a daily practice or a weekly practice is more effective, but just taking that time to reflect on what you can be thankful for in your life. And it doesn't have to be big things. It can be small things as well. A flower in bloom, a cup of tea drunk at the right temperature, very British. Little things like that. When I was very ill, I used to say that if I could count 10 things at the end of the day that I could be grateful for, then I'd had a good day. And do you know what? I never had a bad day because I could always count 10 things. And I think if people can put their minds to that, that's something I think that will help get people through this crisis.
Yeah.
What about you, Keith? What would your top tips be?
My top tips would be to drink plenty of water, would be the first one, I think, because that's something we do neglect. It's the simplest thing in the world for us in this country to be able to do, because we use clean water to flush stuff away that we don't want, which is quite ironic. Yeah, I think it's drink plenty of water. You don't realize how that can affect you physically and mentally as well, because obviously your brain is 90% water. It floats in water, and it needs that substance around it to keep it in good health. The other side, what helped me sort of through mine was tomorrow I'm going to do this positive thing, and you have that plan. And I think once you have a plan, you can then build on that and step up from that. And you use your past positives as stepping stones to your next positive, and eventually you have your path rebuilt, and you're in some degree, you have some degree of control over it. The other side of the well-being stuff is when you go back to work, your workplace, make sure that you're well represented by people towards your employer and things like that, because your employer will just want you to go back and make lots of money. And the thing is, you can only do that when you're really healthy. I can go into all sorts of theories with that, but I won't at the moment. But people will not work 100% of the time. They need a break. They need to be able to take their mind off a monotonous task. They need to get up and walk around. So it's just, you have to think about yourself a little bit, I think, and then think of others, and then think of work. I think that's the order of the day at the moment. But again, water, plenty of water. And try and reduce taking ibuprofen as well, because that's not always so good for you.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you both, Pete and Keith. Yeah. Fahim, you've escaped the top tips. So what?
No, I'm not escaped. I'm still here. I think, it's something we can all contribute to. I would go with sleep. Getting adequate sleep is always very helpful, so we can cope with the stresses of each day as it comes on the next day. Exercise, so as much as you can try and do it, that's why it's provided during the lockdown, time for exercise. So that's always good. Resolving conflicts as and when you go on, that's always handy, so it doesn't build up. And be kind to yourself. No one's getting everything perfect. And it's stressful times. The word unprecedented has been used an unprecedented number of times. Yeah. So I think that really should hammer home to everyone that everyone's trying their best, and people react in different ways. So let's be kind to ourselves and kind to each other. I think as we're coming near the end, and everyone's provided some tips, it's important to mention that we have raised some medical issues, and if you have any specific medical topics or issues that you have, please do see your GP. And today's show, or any of our shows, is not a substitute for specific medical opinion and advice. Also, the next two guests next week we have lined up Dr. Wesley Tensell. He's a GP, Cambridge graduate, no less, and also involved in Rochdale Football Club as a club doctor there, and also Dr. Mehdi, a respiratory consultant from Blackpool Hospital. So we've got a lot coming up next week. Mehran, if you want to finish things up and end the show then.
Yeah, thank you for everyone for listening in and watching our YouTube channel. We hope to do this again next week, same time, 5 to 6 on a Saturday. And, please continue to support us on MEDtalkx podcast, also on iTunes, Spotify, and Twitter. And we also have a Facebook page. So there's lots of things there for you to interact with us. Reviews would be great. Any further thoughts would be very much appreciated. But I would like to thank especially Pete and Keith for sharing their expertise. And especially you guys are doing a lot of important things. And time as well. So that's very important to us.
Thank you very much for having us. Yeah. And stay well to all your listeners.
Thank you. And thank you, Keith.
You're welcome. I mean, the only advice I know is to obviously seek medical help if you're unwell or feel unwell. And the other thing is, if you need any support or anything like that, the district councils are doing the community hubs. So if you have your benefits issues and things like that, please contact your district councils because they will either point you to somewhere or they can help you themselves. They have lots of money to spend, but it is running out. So we do need to make sure that everyone gets a fair share of it.
Great. You've been listening to MEDtalkx on Awaz FM 103.1 FM, Pendle Community Radio, Awaz 103.1 FM. I've been Fahim Shakur, and along with Mehran Javid, have a good afternoon and many thanks for listening and tuning in. Thank you so much.